And there goes the recording. Well, folks, welcome to the May 10th occurrence of the combined work group meeting. First up on the agenda, we have Costin about clean Istio D chart. Costin, do you want to present or do you want me to present?
If you can present, it's even better.
Okay. Give me 1 sec. Oh, seems like I've signed in with the wrong account. 1 minute. There we go.
Okay. I put it 2 days ago on the agenda, so I don't know. I don't think a lot of people had time to read it. The short version is that, well, first of all, what it is not. This is not the same thing with what we discussed last time about the foundation or safe Istio or anything like that. It's not trying to remove APIs first. It's not trying to change anything in the behavior. The main purpose is to have all the API expressed to CRD configs maps, things that are documented on Istio.io, which are independent of the install mechanism. Meaning that if you want to set something in Istio, you should be able to set it in a way that is, part of an API. And I'm not considering values.yaml as an API because it generally is bypassing all the API reviews. It doesn't have testing. If it does have testing, it's usually very complicated because you have to reinstall Istio with, you want to change a field, you need to reinstall Istio and the test suite needs to create a reinstall. And John did some checks on how many times we install Istio. We kind of disagree on the result of the analysis. I mean, the 80 something installs done by Istio. Maybe it's too much, maybe it's too little because it's only covering a very small amount of options. It's debatable, but the point is we have this huge API surface that it's very problematic and very, not the best way to do APIs. So if you scroll down, the short version is that I'm proposing to create a new Istio D chart, which would have mostly no options besides CPU and the standard, things that go into deployment and stuff, no Istio specific options. And then if you install it with this chart, you should have all the equivalent features done through, some in-cluster dynamic config options like, config maps, CRDs, and the whole discussion about which ones are stable, experimental, and how to express them. That's deferred to foundation, safe Istio, or to the API review process that we already have. But the expectation is that, again, it will be a proper API with proper review and proper status, not something that we just slap in values and then do some templating and suddenly it magically works and you have to reinstall Istio to get that behavior. Questions, comments? I'm not going to go into each word in detail. You can please read the doc, leave comments. The requirements are probably the most important things. That's really what I'm hoping we can agree that we should not have hidden APIs or kind of APIs that bypass a review process.
Yeah, I got to say, I really, really like the direction of this because the environment variables and the CLI arguments, I have kept wondering in the past, why do we have all these switches and then we also have mesh config, and it's just confusing because they are not the environment variables, the things that you enable, the features that you enable in the environment variables are not related to the install. So why do you have to set them at install time, right? They could just as well live in something like mesh config. So I have always dreamt of creating sort of an experimental section in mesh config that is just free form and moving everything there in the first step and just getting rid of the environment variables completely that way. And then having sort of a process to promote APIs out of experimental into a real API once we found, hey, we actually need this feature. Let's think about how we can actually have a good API around it instead of just having a switch somewhere.
Yeah, completely agree. That's part of the proposal. If you read that implementation, it's basically one of it is to move all the environment variables somewhere in the config map. Not necessarily mesh config. I mean, my proposal is to actually to put them top level because mesh config, it's a big mess. It's overwritten at install. It has all kind of other problems. So my proposal in this document is to actually create a separate config map so it's not confused with mesh config. And put the environment variable top level so they can be patched easily and they don't. But that's minor. We can debate what's the proper way. John or Kit, I don't know which ones.
I think I was first. So I have a few comments. So I'll say them all, and then we can respond in bulk. So I agree with the general direction. I think having more things at runtime instead of install time is generally good. But I have some concerns with the details of the implementation. So I don't really like the new Helm chart. I think it's already users are confused on installation. Like, should I use the operator, Istio Cuddle, Helm, second Helm chart for the same thing? I'm very worried about having two charts. We also committed to the chart that we shipped as beta. So like with the gateway one, yes, we did the same thing. But there was more benefits, I think, and we never shipped the original chart as beta. We went straight to the new chart as beta. Now we've already shipped Istio D. It's kind of the ship has sailed in my mind. The other thing is almost all the settings, if you actually go through the values.yaml or the charts, it's almost all install stuff. Like that actually needs to be install time. Like 90%, if not more. So the chart is not going to be simple. It's going to be almost as complicated. And the maintenance of these two will be quite hard. I just really don't see the benefit of the second chart. I don't think it holds its weight. The second thing is that a lot of the settings are actually kind of hard to set dynamically. Like we have a lot of circular bootstrap logic if we go to move everything dynamically. Like some of the settings, for example, like mesh config is in the cluster. Some of the settings are how we connect to the cluster, right? We can resolve some of those bootstrap things, but there's a lot of settings that we're talking about. And especially with the fact that a lot of these are experimental features, so they don't get a lot of actual testing, it's even more risky to have these be dynamic, right? Something like enable ambient controllers, for example. Like, could we make it dynamic? Sure. It's pretty hard though. Like it's much easier to have a global variable than doing things dynamically. And the other thing is like, I'm not sure that making experimental features easier to use or dynamically configurable is actually something we want, right? Like stable features, absolutely. But experimental features, like those are experimental. Some pain is required. Like in Kubernetes, if you want an experimental feature, you typically spin up a new cluster entirely to test it out. It's a much higher bar than just restarting Istio D. So,
yeah, to answer in reverse order because it's easier. The proposal doesn't say anything about making features dynamic. I mean, it doesn't say anything about experimental should be easy. It's perfectly fine to have a config mapping cluster and Istio need to restart to get the new global. I mean, we can do quit or do equivalent.
how is that any better than an environment variable?
No, I mean, it doesn't really matter how they are set. What matters is that they are in a resource in the cluster that, again, it's independent of the installation and of the version. So it's basically whatever API we define can be environment variables, can remain as environment, but in a config map. At startup, Istio D can read the config map that is in cluster and has a. So details we can discuss during review, but again, I'm not trying to add features or to make the features more dynamic. Or we would have the option for some of them, which are not necessarily experimental and not necessarily like the throttling interval, for example, which is an environment variable. Maybe when you are under load, you want to change throttling. Again, it's an option, not necessarily something you have to do. But I don't necessarily think I completely agree with you that experimental should not be conflated with this proposal. Now on the Helm chart, I don't really know how we can keep the current Helm chart and you know, with all the options, but also with options removed, is kind of contradictory. And also another part of the proposal is to have this shipped with ambient and be kind of default to what ambient needs, because again, it will take a while to stabilize it, and also ship it at the same time with safe. So it's very likely this Helm chart may not expose all the settings that are today, may have different defaults than the main chart, and it will be easier for user to know that, hey, I want ambient and safe. This is another beta chart that is intended for this use case. I want full compatibility with the old one, because beta means we cannot remove anything really. So we cannot, I don't see how we can explain to the users that the old chart is also full of API, but it's also without an API, and it's, I don't know. Yes.
Yeah, I'm a bit concerned. Like, I don't think moving things out of Helm into config maps is something that users want. Like, if we go to like what users are doing in GitOps, they have an Argo application, and that has a bunch of Helm values, and they set things in. If you just go and take stuff that was in the Helm values and move it into a config map, their experience is just strictly worse, because now they have to go manage this config map separately. Like, they want to use Helm, right? Now they'll probably have to go and package up their own Helm thing because they've standardized on Helm that just has this config map, which they'll put the exact same values, and it's basically the same thing. They just have to do more of it themselves. Like, I'm not sure. I get that you don't like using Helm, but I'm not sure that actually aligns with their users. I would like to get more feedback from actual users before we make any decisions like that.
I didn't say I don't like Helm. I love Helm if it's used for installing stuff.
Yeah, but you're still installing stuff. You're just doing it in a more roundabout way.
Yeah. You may install it, or maybe it's installed for you. I don't know how Istio is going to be installed, but I know that as a Helm user, or if you do, HTTP route, for example, you don't put the HTTP route and all the Google API, all the gateway and everything in the Helm chart. So you roll out with the Helm. You have a YAML file which can be in a Helm chart, so you can still use Helm, but there is no rule in GitOps that all the changes, all the reviews, and all the things that applied are in values.yaml instead of being in an actual resource in a YAML file, proper YAML file.
I don't know. I think it's pretty different. Like, we're talking about configuring Istio D itself. Why would I want that outside of the chart for Istio D? It's not dynamic. It still has to restart Istio D, we've said. Like, is there a single Helm chart on the marketplace that does this today? I've never seen it done. It's a bit concerning. Like, I've never heard anyone ask for this. I've never seen it done. I don't know.
You haven't seen any Helm chart where there's an API, clear API separated from the Helm. So all the APIs, all the products use Helm as API.
No, there's a difference between, I think, configuring the actual controller and using APIs of the product, like HTTP route and a config map that sets experimental features of the controller, or like ports to listen on, things like that. Those are very, very different. And I don't think treating them as the same thing makes sense.
That's perfectly right. I'm not saying everything should be the same. There are exceptions. I mean, ports definitely remain in Helm, but providers, if you want to add a provider, you need to reinstall Istio.
That's, I think, different. Like, if you are making the argument we should make providers a CRD, that's very different than saying we should move everything out of environment variables.
Saying we need to have proper API processor review and decide not automatically put everything in Helm as a hidden API, but have a process that we review each individual thing and decide it's an install option that is legitimately in Helm, or it's something like provider that probably should not be in Helm.
Sure, I completely agree with the principle there. I just don't agree with most or all of the implementation of that principle that's been presented in the doc. That's my concern.
Yeah, okay. Kit, you're next, sorry.
Yeah, I caught the beginning and end of John's section, but I think I generally share some of the same concerns. Like, I love the principle. I think there are several options that you can only set at install time, but are actually affect the runtime and could probably be done dynamically. My concern with the proposal is I don't feel like when you dig in and look at the actual configuration settings to be modifying, I don't know if we end up with a big enough net difference between what we change in Helm or take it from the Helm charts to put in mesh config or whatever new iteration of a mesh config like config map. I don't know if it's going to be too different. And to echo something I did hear John say, I think users really like the values Helm chart piece. That's why we get PRs to the Istio, Istio repo all the time to say, can you please add this specific setting in Helm and the Helm values so that we don't have to use post render. They like that experience, but I think kind of to the point in this doc, it's not. I don't see Helm values as an API, and so where we can, I completely agree with trying to take things and make them runtime configurable, including even some things that are mesh config. I think there's some things in mesh config that might be able to be set. Well, I think there's some things that are properly config is not. But anyway, I generally agree with the re-examination piece, but some of the implementation worries me a bit.
Yeah, again, I'm not proposing anywhere to make anything dynamic. I'm saying just that it may enable in the future to make things dynamic, but everything can stay the same. All I'm asking is that anything that controls the Istio, the mesh behavior, should be part of an API that is reviewed, not slapped on a non-API and then treated as an API. So if you want to change something, or if you want to have something that controls the behavior of Istio, it needs to go through an API review, and it needs to be properly part of the cluster, not something that is, some CI/CD system is doing, and you cannot introspect at runtime, you cannot see at runtime. Even if it's not changeable, even if it's read-only, it's still useful to be able to see the values and to have proper documentation and validation, whatever.
That's effectively installed state, though, right?
Well, if you install with Helm, but you have 3 ways to install it, and there's not guarantees that will have the same install state everywhere. And also, it's kind of what is the definition of each setting? I mean, do you need to restart Istio for each small thing and to do a revision-based install that takes how long it takes, or do you do in place upgrade? It's a very big mess, in my opinion. That's the problem. Mitch.
Yeah, Costin, I think something that would help this proposal along is a handful of examples of items that you would like to see removed from the Helm values.yaml and where they would end up. Are they in a config map? Are they in a CRD? Are they in something else? And then sort of an explanation of why that's better. Our Helm values file, for all of its problems, is actually fairly well documented. It's also in CI/CD systems tend to integrate really well with Helm and less well with config maps, I think, as John brought up. So there may be other values that I'm missing, but I would need something a little bit more concrete to be able to consider.
Mesh config. I mean, it's a config map that you could edit at runtime, but it will be replaced the next time you upgrade. And it's actually per revision, so it's not nobody knows exactly what it does, which one you need to edit. And it has all the providers and all the settings that are, sometimes dynamic, sometimes, don't require installing. And if you reinstall, you actually install a different revision of Istio if you do it properly. So can you find any good reason why values.yaml is the best place to put mesh config?
I don't think that users prefer it outside, but I can sit here and say I don't think it. You can sit there and say you think it. We have no evidence, right? I think if we want to actually answer this, we need to go ask users how they use Helm and see what they would prefer.
We have some data. I mean, we have Google managed product which doesn't install with Helm.
That's not a fair comparison. If they're using Helm, I suspect they want to keep using Helm. You can't say that users that are using a platform that inherently doesn't use Helm don't want to use Helm. That's
okay.
Not a fair argument.
Users who use Helm, I mean, are you saying that all HTTP route gateway and everything should be just pasted in Helm because it's a proper CRD?
I'm not saying that. I've said explicitly that I think that those are different things.
So just because it's not a CRD, it means that it should be in Helm. Everything that is not a CRD should be Helm values. That's APIs that Istio defines. I don't know. You kind of did the same thing with gateways. I mean, the gateways right now, everything that is in Helm is no longer relevant because it's only specific to that installation of Helm. So it's,
I feel like mesh config is inherently different because it's a property of the entire mesh, which is what the kind of admin, it's the same persona. They're kind of tightly coupled.
okay, I mean, if you prefer this mess, that's fine with me. I mean, it's just then art tests. I mean, if that's the API, then at least let's have it documented as an API, treated as an API, tested as an API, and when we discuss foundation, if it doesn't have tests, then it should not be there. Then kind of this proposal falls into if it's not tested, it should not be. Kit, what do you think? I mean, can I just rephrase this to be for foundation and everything in values.yaml remains if it has the test?
I think that's fairly reasonable. I mean, the inherent fork in the road, I think, is go through something like this and extract things out from the values.yaml or start treating values.yaml like an API. Yeah, I think at this point, so many people like using values.yaml and they're used to using values.yaml. And I do think there is some merit to being potentially more clear about about categorizing the different things that are in values.yaml. If it's not a configuration property for installation, then maybe we put that somewhere else in a later time, discuss alternative enablement mechanisms. I do think the mesh config revision scenario is weird. So I think there's merit to the spirit of the proposal. And I think that's something we might be able to tackle in foundation. There's just, I just don't know that there's enough for this particular implementation to make me feel super comfortable about making such broad changes right now.
How about, John, how would you feel about starting a Helm chart with all the values that are not tested removed? Because as a Helm user, you probably don't want to use untested features. So everything that has a test, we keep.
I think it's unrealistic. I mean, what are you testing? Like, you're actually going to go deploy every permutation of values.yaml settings and deployment? There's an infinite number of them, right?
If it has a test in the test suite, in the end-to-end test suite, where we install an Istio with that particular version, with that particular setting, we keep it. If it doesn't, then again, it's a completely untested API that we tell people to use it without knowing it works. So.
I don't know. I don't buy that. Like, these are pass-throughs to the Kubernetes API. We don't test the Kubernetes API. Like, we have a setting that's pilot.rolling max surge.
No. Let's not talk about this. Those are perfectly fine. I'm not touching this. I'm saying Istio APIs that control, provider, throttling interval for Istio, all the things that.
Okay, so mesh config and environment variables, basically.
Mesh config and environment variables. If there is not a test that sets that environment variable, it should not be in the, kind of tested only chart.
I mean, the charts don't even have these values. They're just all pass-throughs to mesh config and environment variables directly. So I don't even know what the chart would be different. It would actually be more. It would be a superset of the chart, like adding validation to it.
Okay, I mean.
Yeah, I just don't get like really what we're trying to solve here. Like, having a new chart that has added validation seems odd to me.
No, what I'm trying to solve is to normalize the API, to make sure that everything that controls the Istio behavior is part of an API that is in cluster and follows the Kubernetes model. We don't have three shadow APIs, because there is operator API, which is actually a CRD. We have Istio Cattle, which has a different set. Most of them no longer apply. And we have values.yaml, which is a third set of APIs that kind of user interacts to configure Istio that only apply if you use a particular model. Okay, I'm removing it. Let's move to the next one. Kit, sorry, you have your.
And the last thing I was going to say is that, I think I do see a problem for what it's worth that needs to be solved. Kawat has a good example in the chat where, using Helm to configure XDS, like the telemetry V2 in the Helm values, it's not super great. We should look at moving that. But I think there are probably less of those things that need to happen in comparison to a lot of the install bugs out there. And I think something to your point about costing, about testing, I think something that's might be fairly obtainable is to start making an effort to use Helm more often in integration tests or in testing in general. From my memory, could be wrong, but I think that a lot of integrations that Istio or Istio operator installs would be great to have those use Helm more frequently. So that would make us feel better, I think, about the end-to-end coverage of those settings.
So to add to that, I don't think we're going to discussion about the next item, the experimental metric expiry option, and the request there was to make it an environment variable. So that means Helm again, and so that seems contradictory to our desire, right? Is to move away. So unless we propose another way that doesn't require Helm, I don't see how we're going to stop adding flags to Helm.
No, but environment variables don't have to be in Helm. So you can create a config map with all the environment variables, and in Helm you can say in env from config map, and then everything is in the config map. And then you can patch it. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah, but if you put it into Git, it's still Helm, right? It doesn't really. It's just an indirect way to use Helm. I don't see how it's different.
You can put a config map in Helm in GitOps as well. I mean, it's not CRDs are normally deployed to Helm, and we can also move the environment. Sorry, I'm kicked out.
Well, I'm just one of that. We have a whole bunch of those. I don't think it's that small of a problem. It is there is a edge-bound variables, there's metric variables, and so on. And we keep adding them, so I don't think it's going in the right direction.
For what it's worth, I think it is the right direction, and I don't agree that we should not be using environment variables for these.
Why do we need environment variables on the control plane to control specific client XDS? It just doesn't. I mean, if you have a big control plane with a variety of workloads, there's no uniformity among them. So there's no real way to have a single variable to control everything.
I mean, these are experimental settings. Like the intent is for someone to go try this out in a test cluster. And then once we find out it's stable, we either remove the environment variable and turn it always on, or move it to a proper API. So it not being dynamic and not being possibly even the most user-friendly is in many ways a feature, not a bug, in my opinion.
I understand it's experimental, but the problem is it's experimental forever, and oftentimes it never goes away.
And that's the bug, in my opinion, not how it's configured. There should not be something that's permanently experimental.
Right. So what we need to start from the desired state and work towards that, rather than having a separate variable that just sits there forever without any future movement, right?
And
Go ahead.
So I just want to say this proposal is pretty much this. And basically, the Helm chart will not have those things that users should not set in the first place. If they want to experiment, they use the other chart. So they can do in the experimental cluster whatever they want with the existing chart, no problem. But if they use this new chart, because there will be no experimental things inside, they will have a production safe environment that is completely compatible with Helm and everything else. And if we decide that some API needs to be promoted and we review it as an API and we want to put it in values.yaml, that's wonderful, because that will be a proper API that we decide intentionally this is supported, it's tested, it's beta or stable, it's not experimental, and it is in Helm because we choose to put it there as an API.
Where I think I disagree, though, is that I don't think that this proposal is the desired state. I think the desired state is graduation, it's promotion. It feels like by creating a separate chart, we're trying to change user behavior.
Yes.
When it's yes, but the users right now users are using these environment variables and such because there's no graduation. So instead of trying to create a solution, this is where I look back and see that foundation. I think maybe is going about the wrong way. Instead of trying to create a solution to what's what I'm looking for. It's the solution making the current state of things fit. We need to just do what we need to be doing and fix the actual bug, which is let's graduate the features. And I think if the proposal had like a specific list of features, I think that's one of the things I'm also struggling with, is to understand which categories, like which features we're talking about. If the proposal instead had a list of features and say, hey, these things should move out of mesh config and graduate to an API. They're widely used, etc. Or these features should stop being environment variables. They can default on for 2 years. We're good to go. I think that's a much more palatable approach rather than starting a brand new chart.
So Kit, I'm completely agree with you. And the way I see it is, yes, everything needs to be graduated. If we create this chart, it will force the issue, because if we are saying that in production, you should only use things that are non-experimental and stable, and this is a chart that has reduction, try it out. If you find any gap, raise a bug and will be forced to promote that particular API or to have a proper way to do it. Right now, we are kind of in a status quo where we are kind of in this limbo zone where users can use whatever they want. We don't tell them that, hey, everything you put in this Helm chart is experimental and alpha. You should not use it in production, but please use it in production because that's the only way to use Istio properly if you want that feature. So it's, again, we need to force the issue at some point. We need to have a way to tell users that, hey, this is a set of APIs that we tested and we are committed to support. Beta plus whatever you want to put there and to graduate. And this is how you can install to make sure you are not using anything that is bad for you.
Yeah, can I chime in? Yeah, can I chime in here? You know, I think maybe it was last week. I think Mitch made an interesting comment that today we already categorized like the future status of like our labels and notations, right? Even some of our functional feature. I think I don't like being forced to not be able to use the feature. I mean, people already complain. It's already hot if we are forcing people and introduce the new chart and say, hey, these are the things that, you know, we believe well tested, you should only be using this. I think it's more confusing for the user. It could, and what if, you know, we said these are tested and still, I'm sure there are still bugs too, right? So I almost prefer what Keith just mentioned, right? Our problem is the graduation problem, right? And the reason we have the graduation problem is a resource problem, right? We have a lot of experimental feature, we have a lot of alpha feature. It takes resource to promote them, right? We have a rigid process. So I'd rather focus on that promotion as needed, or clean up, remove the features who are not should be experimental anymore because nobody using it, but create another set of chart we have to maintain, which could potentially confuse user even more, in my opinion.
So more confused than they are today, where they use untested features in production. How can anything be more confusing for users than this kind of state where we are today?
I mean, at least we document, right? What is experimental? Environment variable by nature is a experimental, and John mentioned earlier it requires restart. It's still D, so people would understand that's not necessary to be used in production, right?
But the argument is that people love the Helm and they want to use the current Helm. At the same time, everything in Helm today is alpha because mesh config is alpha, experimental versus experimental. So what would be
actually
the
no? Facila, I believe, and also Daniel from Solo actually create a bunch of automated tests in Helm. So if you go to Istio.io, all of our Helm pages are automated. I believe Facila actually, maybe somebody else, I can't remember, took the community through Helm beta graduation, I believe, recently.
Helm is better, definitely. Helm has an install method, but the settings in Helm, the values.yaml, they contain literally the mesh config, which is an alpha CRD, which is obviously not, it's alpha, that's why it's called alpha. there is a values.yaml, which is not even a documented API, and then there is the environment variables that are declared as experimental. I mean, saying that Helm is beta doesn't mean everything inside values.yaml is automatically promoted to beta by the fact that we test that we can install with Helm.
That's fair. I mean, that's the same as Istio. You can say it's beta, but it still have environment variable to tune it, right? Like detail configuration itself may not be the same status as overall of Helm, but I
Yes.
think user understands that.
Can you show me in production any user who is not using any alpha or beta when they are putting their front end, and we have examples saying, hey, install Istio with this experimental environment variable? I mean, any user who's not confused by the status of the values.yaml, stability and level.
I don't think we disagree on that, cost, and I think the disagreement is how do we fix that? And you just said it, right? Users are confused by the feature status. So let's fix that. Let's promote be promoted and get to a point where users aren't using experimental enough of things in production.
I see. I don't think we're actually disagreeing with anything. I mean, all I'm saying is, I mean, exactly like you. I mean, we should promote everything and should treat each of them as an individual promotion. What I'm adding to this is, in order to validate what the user needs and to have a clear indication to the user what is the actual state of what is supposed to be used in production today, we should have this chart which is clear that only things that are beta plus and supported are in this chart. So a production user can say, hey, I want to be extra sure that I'm not accidentally setting any alpha feature or experimental. I use this chart and then I provide feedback on things that need to be promoted. And again, Helm is an API. It's perfectly fine. It has validation. It's very good, very reasonable to have some things in Helm, but as any API needs to go through, this is beta and we treat it as beta, not the middle ground. Sorry, I don't know. I'm very unhappy with the current status of things in Helm. That's what. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's part of the problem is that we've been treating experimental as a very lax idea of an experiment. I think as Istio is mature, we should not allow experimental flags that allow any crashes in Istio. So, basic assumption should be that some workloads can run experiments, but they should not crash the control plane. That implies that it should be safe to enable those experimental flags on any control plane, as long as they're bound restricted to the
It's all
workload.
over experimental, but so if it's safe, then we should promote it. As Kit was saying, there are a lot of things that can be promoted and relatively safe. I mean, it's not that, but we don't have a differentiate. We don't have any way to explain to people what's the difference between what is actually beta plus and what is not.
Well, I'm saying that any experiment should be safe to enable on every
completely
control plane installation. That's a minimum bar for any experiment. It's not about safety in terms of feature stability or not data plane effect. Safety in terms of control plane doesn't crash.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's another part of this. That probably I should have gotten to this. The way we do experiments today, which is globally, you have to reinstall Istio, turn this environment variable, start Istio. It applies to the entire mesh at once. That's a very, very dangerous way to do experiments. I mean, it's normally in Google when there is an experiment, Gmail wants to change something, they run it in staging, run it in canaries, they run it on 1% of users, they run it on dog foods. There are all kinds of ways to do experiments that are not global experiments where the entire mesh will go down or be affected. And keeping a separate Istio ID for each experiment is not very feasible. But that's related because part of this is by moving things out of values.yaml, we have an option to put them in things that are per namespace, per pod, as they should be.
Well, it just kind of goes against the full idea of experiment. The full experiment is to validate it fully, not just keep it as a. It's not the point of experiment is not a config option. It's actual some hypothesis that you want to test.
Yeah.
You have to make a decision, and to make a decision, you need to be able to enable it globally always. So unless you run experiments by reinstalling control planes, which is a big assumption. It's not really an experiment. It's just some control plane option that escaped APIs.
Yeah, maybe I'm used with Google style of running experiments or Android or most large products where
No, I think
experiments
that's what most people think of experimental options. That it's an API, experimental config API. So it really assumes that you have an API that's not stable, and it's experimental, meaning you also limit application. When it's just one flag, it skips all of that.
Looks like this proposal is a no-go, so I'll let others explain to users how the current experimental is production ready and should be used in production, but at the same time it's not. So okay, let's move on.
All right, let's go. I think we already covered the telemetry one, right? So let's go to the last one so we have some non-controversial break. This is quick, just more of an FYI. Kubernetes is finally, as far as I can tell, doing the sidecar cap for the native sidecar support. It hasn't merged yet, but it's pretty close. And this PR basically adds support for it in Istio and tested and whatnot. I think there's still a few bugs, which I don't know if they're on our side or their side that I'm trying to work out. But yeah, it mostly works. Feel free to try it out. You need to use the Istio in this PR and also the kind config and the kind image, all three of those to test it out. But all of them are in the PR. So yeah, that's about it.
So what's the impact to the Istio user? Does this mean they don't have to use our pre-stop and pre-start hooks? Like, you know how we had this whole application to proxies ready?
Yeah, so I suspect that when we actually implement this, we'll do some detection of the feature in Kubernetes. If they have it, then we'll just automatically configure it this way, which means that we'll ignore the hold thing because there's no need to hold, and there's no need for this pre-stop hooks or anything like that. Yes, cron jobs will finally work. Lots of things are fixed. I think I actually never tested the cron job. I should test that. The one thing that we should be looking into is, as part of the implementation, the container is actually moved from a container to an init container, which sounds kind of confusing perhaps, but that's how it works. So some tooling needs to be updated if it expects to find the sidecar pod there. I fixed Istio Cuddle in this PR. It's pretty simple, but I suspect things like Kiali and I don't know, maybe whatever other tools. So if you use or are responsible for tools that make assumptions that the sidecar is a container, you should probably also start looking at init containers.
Quick question about the implementation. When you say that it moves it to an init container, does that mean the init container now is sustained throughout the lifecycle of the pod?
Yeah, there's a new field on init containers that basically says like keep it running. And so okay, you can stick it wherever you want. It's in the init container, and then we set that field. And then once it's marked as ready, then it allows the other init containers.
And then if the primary container sets all exit cleanly, it tears the init container down. It doesn't block on the init container being up.
Yeah, I'm not 100% sure it works for jobs, but yes, so that's how it works in general.
So. Yeah, well, that's what I was trying to figure out. If that is the way that it works, then the job should start working. So, yay.
Question is if this will go to production in Kubernetes before we ambient ships where sidecars are gone.
Yeah, ambient completely like ignores this issue, so it's a little.
Yeah, I mean,
short, but it'll work.
No, it probably will not go to production by then, but people will still probably have sidecars, so. It would have been better a year ago or 3 years ago, but it's better now than never, I'd say.
Yeah, and also doesn't mean user would move to that particular Kubernetes version, right? I assume that could take another few quarters too.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean this goes to alpha in 128, and then I don't know. Let's say it goes to beta in 129, then users have to update that. We're still talking like a year probably till even cutting edge.
And it's a migration involved because some things will no longer work, like the proxy CPU, like you said. So maybe it's better for the user to migrate to ambient directly in 1 year.
No, pretty much everything should work.
proxy CPU and
Yeah, proxy CPU, no problem.
it works. Okay.
Yeah, the only thing is like the hold proxy flag is no longer needed because that was a workaround for not having this. But as far as I know, all the functionality works. So
I think this will also have the side effect of potentially helping clean up the race condition, the Istio CNI race condition a bit.
I don't know how it does that, but I did just check and the jobs are fixed. But how does it fix the race? Maybe it does.
Well, so it doesn't fix it entirely, but it removes a lot of the requirement that we have for safeguards. But because it's going to be so long before it gets deployed, it's going to it doesn't really matter. But the entire point of the race condition thing is, no, it wouldn't, because we can still run into the situation where the Istio CNI daemon set hasn't been installed on the node. So yeah, the race condition stuff still needs to be there.
Yep, unfortunately. Someone go fix that in Kubernetes, please. That'd be great.
Yeah, well, there was a paired proposal for this, for fixing the way that CNI worked, but I guess that wasn't implemented.
Does this also fix the network enabled init container problem where
Yes.
okay, cool. So you can start this, you just want to start the proxy init container as the first container and everything should theoretically work?
Yeah, that's why they made it as an init container so that you can choose where it runs. So we'll put ours first, I think. We may need some like customization for obscure cases where you want to run before us, but that's pretty strange. But hypothetically, you could like bootstrap the proxy with certificates or something in a init container. I don't know. It's kind of niche. So
well, actually, so if somebody else is doing the same shenanigan where they inject an init container before us, is there any guaranteed ordering for the evaluation of?
I forget how it works. It's really complicated. We already do basically say inject last and inject first for the validation and the actual IP table setup. So we're already doing this stick first or stick last thing. Now we're just changing what exactly we stick first and stick last, but it shouldn't be a new problem and hasn't seemed to be a huge problem today. So.
Neat.
All right, that's probably enough. We can go back to the doc. Do you want to click on some ideas on installation methods? All right, we only have 5 minutes. That's fine. I think I'll just introduce this and then feel free to comment on the issue, or we'll maybe have a few time for comments. This probably should be a design doc, but right now I was just kind of drafting out some ideas I had before I forgot them. This is kind of similar to what Costin was talking about, but more focused strictly on the install. I've noticed over the years a lot of issues with kind of feature parity between the two Istio Cuddle, Istio Operator, and Helm worlds, in confusion with install methods, despite our best efforts. So for example, one big issue I see is that a lot of people get confused by the Istio Operator API versus the operator versus the Istio Cuddle. Like I've had users that are, as far as I can tell, pretty smart, that I'm like holding their hand, telling them like, no, the Istio Operator is fine, just don't use the Istio Operator. And it's like, it's not really, it doesn't make sense. Like it's very understandable why users don't get it, right? And then there's also some like gaps in Istio Cuddle and Helm around what we persist in the state or in the cluster, validation, that type of thing. So I tried to think of some ideas on how we can improve this. Definitely interested in other ones. My goal with a lot of these was to reduce churn. So like one fix, for example, would be to rename the Istio Operator or entirely rev the API. I'm just not sure it's worth the churn of doing that. Maybe it is, but a lot of these were kind of with the assumption that we should make minimal changes to make small improvements rather than kind of redo the entire world. So some ideas I had, we could just rename in the docs anywhere we say Istio Operator to something like in cluster operator or controller maybe instead of operator. That may be confusing, but some sort of rename to make it more clear and distinguish the Istio Operator. We could also just silently kill it. Like we can just remove all documentation of it, hide the commands. like we say, don't use it. But we could make that a lot stronger of a statement by just not documenting it and pretending it doesn't exist for all purposes without removing it. Go ahead, Mitch, or do you want me to finish up?
You go ahead.
Okay. Another one is, if you don't know, when you install with Istio Cuddle, we put this installed state Istio operator resource, which kind of is supposed to say, like, this is what you installed. And then we have some tools that read that. I think this causes a lot of confusion. We see people that think that this is like reconciled and are like, I modified this. How come it didn't go change my thing? Or why is status not there even though it's in the CRD? Or like, what is this thing? It causes a lot of confusion. I remove this potentially. We would probably need to, we need to replace it with something for the commands that use it, but I think that we could do that with what I'll talk about next. If we stop installing that, we can also remove the CRD from the install and bundle it with the operator install, just to reduce some confusion there. Going along with that, how Helm solves this is they also have basically the same thing, but it's stored in a secret in some Helm format. I don't know exactly the format, but the state of all the releases in some secret. So we could use that for anywhere that we use the installed state. In fact, even if we do nothing else, we should probably do that so that the Helm install has parity. But we could potentially make Istio Cuddle do a lot less. Like right now, we're kind of reinventing Helm. We could just use Helm and be some sort of small shim over it. I'm not sure exactly how small. Like to keep the same API, we at least need some translation from the API we have now to, because we have the not just the values part, but it could be potentially viable. The issue though is I don't know how well that would work with in-cluster operator. I think it would probably work well for Istio Cuddle install, but not sure for the operator. And then do we want those to be different code bases? Maybe. Final idea I had was just to allow you to not put the kind Istio operator in the YAML file that you pass to Istio Cuddle install. And so you just have like spec with no kind. It's a little wonky, but at least it would allow us to not have the Istio operator to Cuddle install. And we could update all the docs to remove it, which may reduce some confusion. That would also prevent people from trying to kubectl apply it, although removing the CRD would also prevent that, but maybe it's a less intuitive. No kind, it's more obvious that it's not something you should kubectl apply. All right, that was everything. Go ahead, comments. I think Costin was first, maybe Mitch. Oh no, Mitch was first.
Mitch, you go ahead.
Okay, so I like some of these ideas, but I did hear you say something about not recommending that people use Istio operator. I thought that our messaging had been that we don't recommend new uses of Istio operator, but that it's still supported for our existing users. Is the proposal that we change that messaging, or did I misunderstand the messaging?
It currently says, yeah, for new, but yeah, it does only say for new.
Is it time to encourage users of the existing operator, like to officially deprecate it and encourage them to move on?
The reason that we haven't said the word deprecate is that, well, when you say deprecate, do you mean remove it?
No, deprecation is the announcement. Removal happens,
Yes.
I don't know, what, a year later?
Okay, that's, so everyone, yeah, so deprecation technically just means discourage, right? From a dictionary standpoint. But everyone to them means either it's deprecated, will be removed soon, or it already was removed, in my experience with talking to users about this. So that's why we specifically did not use that word. But at the time, at least when we made this decision, probably over a year ago, we didn't want to remove it because we didn't want to cause churn to users, right? Now, maybe it's time and it's been long enough, but we had the era of install churn in Istio. So we've been kind of keeping bad decisions around in favor of not having more churn.
One crazy idea just came to me. How about we create a new Helm chart that doesn't have all those operator install options and everything else? And we tell people when they adopt ambient, safe, and everything, they have, a clean API and because I think your proposals and ideas are pretty much the same what we discussed earlier, where basically we have 5 APIs that are not Because if you look at CRD, you will find, I think Galley is still in the CRD, or did someone remove it? And
It's probably
Mixer and-
removed, but
Oh, we removed it from CRD, backward incompatible change. Anyway, my point is, I think what we argued earlier is, in fact, we are in strong agreement that the current situation with 5 install APIs is probably not ideal.
so you want to add a 6th one?
No, the 6th one will not have Istio options. That was really the point, because all of them have the problems that you put the config in a secret, you put it in a CRD, you put it somewhere.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. I don't think those solve the goals that I was trying to solve unless we remove the other options. My concern is that people don't understand what to use or install, and they get confused when they try and do it. And that Helm doesn't have parity with Istio Kettle. Adding anything new to Helm, whether that's a good idea or not, I don't think solves those problems. So I think that is what separates the two proposals that we have. Mine is about making what we have understandable and usable. Like, you can always add something new, but it doesn't make the old stuff understandable unless you remove it, right?
The old stuff, I don't think we can remove it, because it will create a lot of problems for the users.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
for
That's
ambient,
why.
we remove half of the API. I don't think it's too bad to, when we remove half of the API, to also remove, the pre-install options and have a clear transition.
Yeah, I mean, we could say that ambient's only supported in Helm if we wanted to make a very, very strong commitment to Helm, for example. That still
Without
doesn't solve the.
installing options. That's really my point. I mean, we should not perpetuate this required Helm and Helm as an API. Anyway,
I think we all have
yeah, feel
another
free to
meeting
leave
that we
comments
have
on
to-
the. Oh, sorry,
go ahead.
Mitch. Yeah, we'll go to the ambient meeting. Thanks, everyone.